Hello and welcome, everyone. It's amazing to be here at LudoNarraCon, and we have an amazing panel prepared for you. This is Story is Where the Heart Is, or how VanCity devs evoke emotions in games. We're here to have an intimate and personal chat about the role of emotions in narrative design. From 10 spooky card games to colorful music journeys, grim revenge tales, and even heartfelt cribbage matches, we are four indie devs. All of us are based here in Vancouver in Canada, and we can't wait to share what inspired us to weave these new stories that we came up with, that we worked on. And also, it's not just the preparing, not just the putting it together, but also if the outcome paid off. So before we start, though, because we're going to talk about emotions, just a friendly trigger warning. We'll be dealing with emotions, as I said, and that can lead to personal, messy, positive, negative emotions and messages. It can go all over the place. So in particular, we're also going to deal with grief. And if any of those subjects are troubling to you, just please take whatever steps you feel are necessary to feel comfortable. Now, I'll start introducing myself, and then we're going to do a round here and go through all of the panelists. I'm Arthur Protasio. I'm a multi-platform writer and narrative designer. And for this panel in particular, I'm going to talk about my experience writing and designing the narrative of the tactical RPG Sword Legacy Omen, and also the VR adventure game Angest. And in these games, the emotion that I mostly dealt with, if we can call it an emotion or a feeling, was obsession. And that's something that I'm going to dive into later. But now, Greg, if you could introduce yourself.
I'm Greg Lobanov, indie game developer. I worked on Wandersong in 2018 and Chicory, A Colorful Tale, which came out in 2021. I'll mostly be talking about Chicory. It's like a coloring adventure game. And that game is really about sort of a lot of the feelings and experiences associated with being a creative person. So that's the kind of stuff I'm going to be talking about.
Fantastic. Now, with us, we also have Daniel.
Hey, yeah. So my name is Daniel Mullins. I'm an indie game developer, best known for the indie games Pony Island, The Hex, and most recently Inscryption, just last year. And Inscryption, there's a lot going on there. It's not like specifically created to elicit any like particular emotion. So I decided to talk about a specific scene near the end of the game that I've heard from players is the most emotionally resonant. And so it's kind of elicits a feeling of nostalgia, but more of a sad or melancholic brand of nostalgia. And yeah, that's what I'll talk about.
Does that mean we also need a spoiler warning for this talk?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Consider
Amazing.
Consider yourselves warned.
And we also have Leanne with us.
Hi there. Hi, I'm Leanne Roed. I'm one of the devs of Cribbage With Grandpas. I've worked on a bunch of other stuff in the industry. I'm a game designer here in Vancouver. But with Cribbage With Grandpas, we tried to capture the experience of kind of comfortably existing near a loved one, and putting that into emotional terms. We landed on just the feeling of connection.
Fantastic. Awesome. Okay, so now that all of you know who we are and what we've been up to, I'll take the first leap and just start talking about my experience, and mainly, as I mentioned, the emotion of obsession, or the feeling of obsession that was really drove the experience behind Angest and Sword Legacy. But then afterwards, we're going to hear it from Greg, Daniel, Lan. And then for the second part of our talk, we're also going to hear about the payoff, or how, if we believe the consequences and the reactions to the story, the stories that we put together led to positive outcomes. So specifically for these two games that I worked on, it's interesting to mention and talk about obsession, because I know myself, and I mean, I'm speaking only for myself, but I know that in general, it's very easy for us to obsess over goals, right? It's not just about the game, it's about our life in general. Sometimes we have a specific dream, sometimes we have something very specific, either it's a career goal that we're going for, or sometimes it's associated to relationships. But the term obsession is about desire, in my opinion, taking a bit too far, or desire gone wrong in many ways. It's like the want that goes overboard. And that's something that I really, really wanted to discuss, because it's basically that turning point where you start losing control over things. And we've all been there. But what's interesting is that I keep thinking of my past, and I guess this is where it's really connected to the games, where I originally went. My background is, although I'm a writer, but my background is in law. I originally went to law school, and I remember it was a tough time when I was trying to decide my future. What was I going to do? What was my career about? And I really was focused on other things. But at one point, I saw myself having to go through this process of having to study all of these topics and subjects that weren't really, in time, I just came to realize they weren't really going to fulfill me. But I knew that if I wanted to move forward, at least that's how I was dealing with things at the time, I had to graduate. I had to get that done. So it turned into sort of an obsession naturally, because I knew I had to move forward with that, and I needed to get to the end at any and all costs. And then I guess it starts evolving to a point where maybe it's a bit of a paranoia, in the sense that you can't really think of anything else, and you want to make sure that you want to get it done by all means. And that was a very, very, very strong sensation that stuck with me. It's in the past, and I'm very, very happy that it's over, but I'm also very proud of what I achieved. It's just that I know that it took over. It really affected me, my life in general, in so many ways. And in Sword Legacy, for example, this is a retelling of the King Arthur legends. It's a retelling of the Excalibur legends. What we do in the game is we have the protagonist Uther, and Uther is your, in some ways, you'd expect him to be your traditional knight in shining armor, but there's a much darker, there's a grim tone to the game. So you come to realize that Uther really is this revenge-obsessed character. And we play around with the history of Great Britain. We have Uther coming from Mercia, and Uther really just wants to move forward in the sense of being able to get over that desire for revenge. But to the point where he even goes after, for example, the Excalibur sword, which Merlin in the game, in the story, even tells Uther that it's not meant for him. So that's the obsession that we worked with on a higher level in terms of the story. But then when it came to the mechanics specifically, what I really like is the metaphor of how we specifically, the team, obviously, we came together to feature this mechanic of the willpower system, very much inspired by games like Banner Saga and Darkest Dungeon. And in it, you use it to buff your skills. You get more action points. It's a tactical RPG. You get more attack points, defense points. But the more you use your courage, let's put it this way, your willpower, the closer you are to panicking. So what I really like about that metaphor is how if we give into obsession, the more we're desperately trying to achieve a goal, the closer we also are to our ruin, or to messing up, or to letting go, and then at some point just really seeing the dire consequences of that. And that's for Sword Legacy. For Angest in particular, it's a very interesting game. It's a VR adventure game where you're an astronaut, you're stuck in the spaceship with this mysterious AI. And it is really, I'm very proud of what we achieved as a metaphor for a toxic relationship. So you're trying to break out of that relationship while you're dealing with that AI. And again, you're at one point, depending on how much you explore, it's a branching narrative game, you start to get obsessed in trying to find a way out. And again, that can have drastic consequences. So in general, I just really like how these two games really, we as a team, we really looked at towards that experience and thought, how can we manifest that feeling? How can we make the player feel sometimes claustrophobic, in the sense of, I'm stuck not only in this physical space, but also in this relationship, and I need to get out. But how much am I willing to do to get out of it? And is that really even healthy? And I think really the lesson here is more of obsession can lead to it is unhealthy by nature, and it will lead to very unhealthy circumstances. So in general, that's the gist of it. When we get to the second part, I'll talk a bit about how players and people reacted to that. Greg, take it away.
Yeah. So I talked about how Chicory is about sort of their feelings of being a creative person. That's something that came up really naturally. I mean, the starting point for the game was making a game where you were on an adventure drawing. And even from the very first prototype, where there was like a blank screen you could draw on, there was this underlying anxiety that I could feel from just like trying to draw something specific with really imperfect tools. And a lot of the game is kind of built around that friction that comes up naturally when you are trying to draw, and the anxiety that comes with that. And also just the lived experience of myself and everyone else who worked in the game, because all of us are creative people professionally. So a lot of us have dealt with a lot of the weird friction that comes up with when you're making art in public and sharing kind of like personal creations with other people. And we like to bring up a lot of those kind of situations in the game directly. So like some examples are like you might meet a character in the world of the game who wants you to like paint their house or something, and you'll paint their house, and then different characters will react to the art you've made in different ways. A lot of them will like what you did, but some of them won't. And that's something that you kind of have to deal with sometimes. Like you'll go to an art school and you'll get like critique on your art. Again, usually positive, but sometimes not. Something that I really like later on in the game, you'll meet a character who becomes like your number one fan. She's like obsessed with you and has been following you around and looking at all your art. And she actually will draw you fan art of something that you drew earlier in the game and give it to you. So there's like kind of just all these different little moments and experiences that are kind of speaking to that. Yeah, just that experience of being a creative person and living in that creative world. So like, yeah, there's a lot of conversation that comes up from that. But like moment to moment, the way the gameplay was designed was also sort of sensitive to that. So a lot of the actual kind of gameplay interaction design was built around trying to actually make the player feel relaxed and comfortable. Because like if you, yeah, basically like you want the players to be sort of feeling like comfortable and relaxed so that they can be creative. Something we found really early on is that when you force people to be creative, like you can't advance past here unless you draw something kind of thing, then the task, the job of drawing something, yeah, it basically becomes a job or a task. It's like a thing that you have to do, and it's not something that you do for fun anymore. And what makes something really feel creative and expressive is when you are motivated on your own to do it. So we put a lot of work into trying to make a space that was really comfortable for the player to basically just exist in. The basic format of the game, it's like a top-down adventure game, sort of like a Zelda. But unlike other like Zelda games, there's no enemies. There's nothing that like jumps out at you or surprises you. At no point do you require like reaction speed to react to something. So the space, like the world that the game exists in, is sort of like just existing quietly and reacts to your presence in it. Like it waits for you to come to it. And that means that players basically get to engage with everything in the world at their own pace. They decide how long to spend on things. There's actually not even a requirement for you to draw at any point, really. So the amount that you draw is totally based on your own comfort level, and that means that like anything that you inject into the game, creative wise, like that's something that you chose to put there of your own volition, and that adds a lot to the conversation that happens around that. Like when characters react to it, or when someone draws you fan art or something that you were drawing just for yourself, like that really specific feeling that you get from all that stuff. I don't know. Yeah, it only works because of the way the game offers space to the player. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Let's now hear Daniel. How about you?
Yeah. So I guess I'll give some context of the scene. And like I said, there's been a spoiler warning. So go home if you're worried about that. You probably are home, but turn off your computer. Don't just close the browser, turn off the whole computer. Anyway, so for Inscryption, in the months leading up to the release, I ran a beta, and it was a public beta. Many players were in it, and I was getting tons of player feedback. And one of the things I learned was that players liked the first part of the game much more than the rest, I was finding. And to describe what that means, there's three major parts of Inscryption. And the first part is the kind of the stuff you see in the trailer and a lot of the marketing material. But then there's two other parts that are wildly, well, quite a bit different in a few ways. And yeah, people love the first part. It resonated with them on some level. And some people were disappointed to get past that and realize that they had this rest of the game to play that wasn't that. Some people were even angry about that. But knowing this, I mean, I still tried to improve the other two parts of the game, but knowing this, with the finale, tried to tap into this knowledge that I knew that they were nostalgic for this part that they loved, and they had now been 4 to 6 hours of gameplay not seeing it. So I had some idea of what I want to do with the finale, but with this in mind, it kind of solidified this thought that you'd encounter the opponent from the first part of the game, but in a different light. At this point, the game Inscryption is being deleted and bits of it are disappearing. And this opponent that kind of has been an antagonist to you for much of the game is now in a position where his world is being deleted and he's about to be deleted with it. And so I really tried to play into that. And of course, not only is his world being deleted, but your memory of that kind of happy part of the game for many people is being deleted. I tried to tap into the nostalgia part pretty heavily by having your final deck from part one be dealt back to you. And I guess this kind of goes along a little bit with what Greg was saying of having your prior decisions acknowledged, like with that fan artist in Chicory. But Leshy will make comments about, the more powerful cards you made during that last run in part one, and say things like, oh, you did a great job with that card. Good job. I'm proud of you and stuff. And then eventually bits of the game are deleted, even the most essential parts like the scale that dictates whether you win or lose. And Leshy, your opponent, says to just keep playing. It's just for the sake of the game now. No one's going to win. And then eventually he offers a handshake. And then when you accept the handshake, he's deleted along with the rest of it. And that scene seemed to really, well, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the payoff section. So I'll stop here and Leanne.
It's awesome. I really like the fact that you already started getting dragged into the payoff section, because it's really, really emotional, and it's part of the experience that you put together. But we'll get to that in just a second. Leanne, how about you?
Sure. Yeah. So sad for that person in that game now. Sorry. So process that a bit for a second. Well, okay. So Cribbage with Grandpas, talking about connection. It took me a little bit to get my head around this for this panel. English is a really unsatisfying language. I don't know any other languages, so I guess I can't really say that with much authority, but it seems unsatisfying to me because I found this difficult. Basically, I was looking for a little bit more nuance than just connection, and I talked to my co-developer, Justin Smith, as well, to get his take. But I feel somewhat satisfied that connection is at least a feeling or sensation that even now, especially now, even before the pandemic, one that many, if not all of us, have struggled with at different times in our life. And it also sounds a little funny to land on connection as a pillar in a single player mobile game. But I think that games in general, even the single player ones, are an overlooked tool for exercising the social muscles that are used in human connection. I'm not a psychologist, but I believe that it can be just as powerful a learning experience as in a strategy game when our logic skills are utilized, or in online role-playing game when our ability to work as part of a team is enhanced by maintaining a guild. I think that when we reflect on where we come from and remember the people we care about, we strengthen our ability to empathize and connect with each other. And that's kind of where we're coming from with that idea of connection. For those of you who don't already know, in our game, you create a grandpa using a simple avatar creator. Choose a location and a snack, and then select personality modifiers from a short list to inform how the grandpa will talk to you during the game. So like serious versus silly, grumpy, sweet, tough, that kind of thing. And then you call them up from your contacts list and play crib. It gets a little bit deep and complicated when I talk about this part, so I usually don't, but I'm going to right now. So apologies in advance, I guess. I experienced a big personal loss when I was a teenager, and as a result, I spent a really long time thinking about and feeling grief. And grief isn't an emotion we were designing around. I think if our game were in any way explicitly about grief or loss, the magic might just evaporate. But that experience informed a lot for me. Death is obviously a very powerful disconnector, but even just aging into an adult separates us from experiences that we have had with our loved ones that we can't ever return to. And there's a lot of value in just honoring those memories. And our game provides essentially a space to think deeply about someone, real or imagined, in a really safe, sometimes funny, low stakes kind of way. The intention is to invite the player to bring up a potentially painful memory, interact with it, laugh about it, exist with it, play with it. But everything that really matters takes place inside your head, really. Like, we didn't even create the game part. Cribbage has been around for centuries. But what we did create was that space to feel those feelings. Or not, you can just play cribbage, which is important too. So yeah, we designed the experience around what would best simulate a real game of cards with a real person, calling them up, chatting casually with them, noticing the kind of snack they enjoy. It was an exercise in trusting the player to imprint over what we made and giving them just enough structure to kind of wrap those memories around. We asked the player when they're creating the grandpa, what's your grandpa's name? And it's meant to disarm you a little bit, just a little, just like it would in real life. So it's a personal question. The hope is to prime the player to really follow that person through their own remembrances and find themselves close to them again. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing, Lan. It's I really like what you mentioned about the name, because I think that's such an important part of when we're thinking of even emotional design. It's something so simple from a production perspective, but it has such great impact when we can name characters, when we can name objects, or it completely changes our connection. And connection, again, was the term that you talked about. So, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all creating experiences that we want to really establish a strong bond with our audience, with our players, with the people that are going through the stories that we're putting together. And I think there are different ways to do that, but it's very interesting how each of us found a different avenue, a different aspect, or something that could speak greatly to us, obviously, and that we could share that. When it comes to the reaction of the audience, I'm thinking right now of, in my case, of Sword Legacy and Angest. And it's interesting, I immediately think of a review that I read for Sword Legacy, and it wasn't even a positive review. It was more of a negative review, saying that the players, and again, from the game design perspective, it's something very hard to read, and you feel a bit as if you've like failed. But I read a review that was kind of like, oh, I went through all of this story, all of this journey. And obviously, Sword Legacy in particular is not it has some branching narrative moments, but it is not per se a branching narrative RPG. So you do go pretty much through the linear story of Uther and the party that the other characters that are with Uther. But like most Arthurian tales, you do have a good degree of tragedy. And now I'm also doing as Daniel and going into a bit of a spoiler territory. But it's just that we wanted to do the setup for the sword in the stone. So you get to find out how exactly the sword ended up in the stone for Arthur to pick it up years later. And we do that by actually, in a very tragic moment, actually having Uther die when he's trying to face specifically his nemesis. And the stone is actually the burnt body of Goloa, who is his enemy. But then Uther also perishes in that process, and major spoiler. But it's so interesting because when I read the review was saying, like, I love the experience, but I felt that that the journey almost wasn't worth it, because I went through this lengthy process, and at the end, it felt like I lost so much. And from a narrative design perspective, that's what we wanted. And the obsession was there. It's like, hey, this is a cautionary tale, almost like a fable. You know, you go through this, there's a very big chance that consequences are very likely going to be extremely negative, and that might lead to your ruin. But again, that is a tale where you don't really change the ending of the story. And it was a very different take when we saw the player reaction to Angest. And in Angest, again, you're stuck in the spaceship and you're dealing with Constantine, who's the AI, but you do have 3 different endings, and the endings are very much reliant on what you explore throughout the ship and what you can find. And as an overseer, the AI is going to tell you to do things, and you can choose to, at your own pace, try to go through other paths. And because we have different endings, even endings where, yes, you choose to essentially assimilate with the AI, with the machine, that's, again, your own decision. Of course, your own decision influenced by this very oppressive relationship that exists with the machine. But still, it's something that I thought was very interesting because we got lots of positive reactions to the experience, as in people would note some endings that are particularly sad, but they would say, I loved how I went through this experience and I got to make these particular choices. Now, of course, agency and choice isn't something new to games. It's inherent to games, and it's a very important part of the experience. But I just thought it was very interesting how obsession played out in different ways in these two different games. You know, they both have agency. Of course, you can make decisions. I guess that in Sword Legacy, the main decisions that you make, it's more about the cliche, but it's more about the journey rather than the ending. And in Angest, it's also about the journey, but the ending has more impact. So I just loved seeing this reaction. You know, like on one, you have an experience that is, I like to call it a bit like David Lynch in space. It's a bit trippy, but then when it's Sword Legacy, it's more this grim medieval fantasy world, and both of them deal with obsession, but the player reactions were very different in this sense. And for me, that was something that really, really spoke to me because I felt fulfilled as a content creator in the sense of I managed to communicate the message that I wanted to share. But on the other hand, I thought, yeah, from now on, I definitely need to embed my stories with more hope. And I think that's something that it's something I've been thinking so much about. And I think it's also very important because we have a very important role, not only in society, but among our family and our friends, of just also sharing these positive messages. And for me, that's there was the lesson or the message that I wanted to share with the audience, but that's the lesson that I learned from these experiences.
Yeah, that's really cool. And actually, so this made me think about something that we were dealing with in Chicory when we were working on it. That I was thinking about a lot when I was sort of in the early planning phases for the story, because it is a game about creativity. So like a lot of my plans early on, when I was thinking about the story of the game, they were a lot more about like one individual's creative journey. That's the kind of story that I really, really like. Like there was an anime that came out recently called Keep Your Hands Off Isaacin, about like these characters who are making anime, and in the anime, it's a really, really great anime. But anyway, like any story that deals with like people trying to make something, I think is always really cool. And something that I realized early on in Chicory is that we could not do that in our story at all, because the player is the one making art. And so if there was any, like the story inserted basically any reaction for the player character to their own work, then it would totally change the player's like relationship with it. So for example, like if the story was, oh, like, you know, main character draws something and then they say, oh, like, I don't like how this looks, you know, like as a player who just drew that, for the person you're playing as to say, I don't like what I just drew, would have such a horrible feeling to it. And even to say, like, for the game at the end, for that character to say, oh, like, I like how I'm drawing better now, like I think I'm a better artist, the player might totally disconnect from that, because in fact you don't even know if the player did get better at drawing. In fact, they might have gotten worse, or they might have just like not tried as hard by the time they got to the end, or whatever, right? So we can't make any assumption about how the player feels about what they drew, and because of that, like the player character can't talk about that. So like something that Arthur mentioned about how like you're playing the game as this hero character, and at the end he like loses everything and dies, and that like how that is really like difficult. That was something that I realized would happen if we had like done our story a certain way in Chicory, basically. So we avoided that like very, very rigidly. Like the player character almost never actually talks about her own art at all. You always get reactions from other people, and we again always give the player space to sort of like decide how they feel about what they just drew, and let them kind of feel any way they want about it. And I have to say that like when I'm looking back at the response that the game had overall, it was surprisingly positive. Like when we were working on this game, I actually thought that a lot of the content, the story content, was like almost like too narrowly specific, because you know it's all based on my experience making stuff. So it's this like conversation about like what is it like to be making things and releasing things, and it's like who in the world, like how many people in the world actually like make art and release it or make games or whatever, right? But it turns out that a lot of people who played this game related to it very, very closely, and a lot of people related to it, you know, not even as artists necessarily, but as people in different industries. Like we were watching streamers play a game, and like Twitch streamers were relating so hard to the struggle of like presenting yourself and putting on a show and like trying to like craft something to like be for other people in this way that totally makes sense, but I just wasn't thinking about at all when we were writing the story. And so like that's just one example, but there were a lot of people who basically found different ways to relate to the story that we told. Um, and that was really, really, really cool to see. I mean, like my favorite kind of reviews that this game gets to are from people who they'll like say things like, "I don't think of myself as a creative person. Like I haven't drawn since I was a little kid or whatever. But I played this game and I realized that actually it's really, really fun to draw. Like sometimes I draw for fun now, like just because I realized that it's fun to do. Like I found a new way to sort of express myself, and that's like my favorite thing that this game could do for people. And I think that all that was only possible because basically we took the step back in terms of the storytelling, and we're made so much space for players to kind of create that for themselves. So I'm grateful that we did, because it wasn't easy to do. Like it kind of went against a lot of things that I wanted to do initially, but the response to it was really, really positive, and I feel confident that like we made something that made a positive impact on the people who played it. So yeah, I'm really happy for that. Yeah, and that's it. I'll stop talking.
That's amazing. Amazing. Love to hear that, the reaction and how people enjoyed that experience. Daniel, was it the same for you?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could claim to like change people's lives in the way that like they would pick up a new skill or something. That's pretty cool. I wouldn't want people to repeat some of the actions that you do in Inscryption. So maybe that's for the best. But but as far as like some of the payoff for my I guess emotion fueled scene, probably would just be the fact that it was a strong scene for people. They just as far as like talking to people who play the game or reading reviews online, it seems to be one of the things that comes up the most for people who have played it all the way through. And so that just says to me that it was a success. For whatever reason, they found it emotionally resonant. Maybe it wasn't what I had in mind, where it was this nostalgia for an earlier part of the game. It could have been just this like switcheroo that they're now feeling empathy for someone who is so cruel to them earlier on, or that just the way Leshy dies is just kind of quiet and sad, and that elicited something in them. And then I think to zoom out and look at the game as a whole, and at the risk of having too much of an analytical mindset about making art, I think about a psychological phenomenon called the peak end rule, where people tend to remember an experience primarily or just proportionately based on the ending of it and the peak of it. So if you do a long hike, you might not remember the grueling burn on your muscles. You just remember how amazing it was to get to the top, and then you remember how good lunch was when you got back down again or something. And so with that in mind, I think sticking the landing on an ending is really important, and it will probably strongly influence the way people talk about and think about your game after completing it. And then I guess another thing that I found interesting, maybe that I could attribute to the scene, is just the way that the Leshy character is viewed. Like I think like my friend was like, "Oh, I finished the game. Leshy is a homie," or like stuff like that. Like is a weird thing to say if you had only played up to the halfway mark or something, where it's like this character is killing you over and over and taunting you and stuff, but people seem to come out of the game experience with this like affection for this character, which I think is interesting, and probably in large part due to this scene. So yeah, that's how it worked out for me.
I love the what's the name again? The peak and the name.
End, like the end of the experience.
Oh, peak end rule.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Lan, how do
Yeah.
you feel about all of this?
Oh, many ways, many emotions. But like, how do I feel about our game and if it paid off? Like, too long didn't read good. But basically, like, this is gonna be like kind of rambly. I hope that's okay. But like, I took kind of like a really weird big risk to make Cribbage with Grandpas. I took some time out of my career. I was only able to do that because of my circumstances. Save some money, have a supportive family that would have helped me if it really didn't pay off. Oh, sorry about the screams of my child in the background, if you can hear them. Um, Basically, and like I only met Justin even because I came out to Vancouver for an expensive game design school. So it's like very like specific circumstances that kind of aligned. All that to say, like, just a quick aside, it's so great now that there are more funding structures starting to pop up because there are different grant structures and things here and there popping up to help um, mitigate some of these risks, and publishers appearing who really care about unique experiences. But just that landscape in general is really challenging for anybody. But anyway, so our game came out in 2016, which feels roughly like 20 years ago in mobile game terms. And looking back at all of that has been really lovely, because I actually hadn't thought about it in that long when you approached me about this panel. But it's really, really lovely to look back on it. And I found a bunch of documents that I kind of forgot I'd made. Like I sent this survey out to friends and family to ask them about their grandpa experiences. And I did this this volunteering with a local seniors network called Friendly Visiting, where you can get paired up with an elderly person who just would like more people to talk to. And that was a great experience in itself and highly recommend it, although the pandemic has obviously made that very challenging. But more than anything, just making the game and getting to have that experience of making this game has paid off in and of itself. And I mean, I was looking through my email to try to find a message to share because we do get them. But it's because people are usually talking about their real grandpas. It felt a little bit personal. So I decided to just read part of an article. I hope that's not weird to do. That came out around the time we released the game. And it goes, "We never played cribbage when he was alive, or any games really. He did like to water ski though, and later in life to drive the boat while I did. There's a fountain over his right shoulder where he sits in the game, and that reminds me close enough. And so a few times a day, I play cards against him." And that was from an article called "This iPhone Card Game Might Help You Cope with Loss, Weirdly" by Duncan Cooper, which I think is probably just the best possible title of an article that could have been written about our game. Just overall, it was one of the best. It's been one of the best game dev experiences that I've had in my life. Much of this is because of my co-developer Justin. I was a fan of his games before I came out to Vancouver, and I was like floored that he wanted to work with me. We would just meet up every couple of weeks, talk about what we wanted to do, go off to our respective spaces and do the work. As process goes, it was very light on traditional strategies, and more just about kind of reaching consensus and defining features. And it wasn't like a wild commercial success or anything, but it's hovered between 4 to 5 stars on the App Store. And it still makes a little bit of money. And even now, years later, we'll get the occasional email or review from people thanking us for making the game. People have written that the game has moved them to tears, and it has made them feel closer to people that they have lost. And honestly, that experience is just truly wonderful. Every time somebody takes the time to reach out, it's amazing. I mean, other players spend a fair amount of time trying to convince us that the grandpas are cheating. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but that's also interesting. But yeah, essentially it kind of just matters how you define paid off. But in my own terms, I consider it very much so a success.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing, because I think that as you were speaking, I was thinking how, at least for me, this whole process of not just creating, but then again, seeing how people react to what we put together, it's very therapeutic, in the sense of I'm going through the process of organizing my emotions, and then I'm going through the process of not only trying to make sense of them, but show them and share them in a way that people can relate to. And Greg, you talked about relatability, and people in the chat are in fact talking about like how Chicory was indeed super relatable. And I think it's so cool because it's that, like, we're trying to find this connection, this element of how do we make sense of what we're going through and how we share that, and then obviously how people make sense of what we offer them. So I think that's fantastic. We're a little bit we're almost out of time here, so I'm actually wondering if any of you would like to share, now that we talked about what we put together and how people reacted, what do you think awaits you in the future? As in, what sort of emotion, or even as in like, well, if there is a lesson that I definitely learned. I mean, for me, it was the whole thing about like, I loved what I put together, but I definitely want to spread more hope. And I wanted to hear that from any of you who wants to share.
I wanted to take a minute actually to plug something here in Vancouver. There's an event that Leanne helps organize called Projector. It's a really, really cool event. Obviously hasn't run for a little while, but it's a sort of a showcase where game developers get together. Someone curates a selection of sort of art games that we all sort of play together and talk about in the space together. What's cool about it is that it exposed me as a Vancouver resident to a lot of really cool art games. Not from Vancouver necessarily. Like when people are curating it, they'll usually pick some kind of theme, and they'll get a bunch of games from, could be 10, 20 years ago or just last year or whatever, right? They'll get them all together to show them together. What's neat to me is it kind of exposed me to just a broader world of art game design. That was really useful for me as a game designer when I think about like building experiences about emotion, because when you think about the way people make art games, those are games where people are very willing to sort of make concessions in the design or the fun of a game to make something that elicits something more emotional or speaks to a more specific experience. That's something that I didn't really have a lot of exposure to, but I learned a lot about how to think about games that way from going to events like that and from playing games like that. So that helped me a lot when I was working on games like Wandersong or even Chicory, just thinking about like how I can compromise some things to focus on other things and how to make experiences that are more emotional. So for people who are really interested in general in this kind of like field of game design, I think just playing more art games, looking at itch.io, or like finding people on Twitter making cool games, whatever, basically playing like smaller titles that have like a more specific emotional like motivation behind them, I think is really, really cool and inspiring way to basically learn about game design. Yeah, I learned a lot from.
That's so cool of
That
you to
is so
say,
true.
Greg. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah.
And thanks for putting it together. Projector is amazing. I've been to it. In fact, I can't remember the name of the game, but I remember one amazing game that it was a co-op, 2 players, and you had to always hold each other's hands. Maybe the title is something like that.
Yeah, that game was
And
awesome.
it was fantastic, an amazing experience. So I echo what Greg just said. Projector is a must.
Well, I'll let the other organizers know. Thanks. That's really, really lovely.
Yeah, it sounds. I'd love to join if it comes back online, because I never got to attend before the thing.
We're talking about it. We're trying.
Cool. Yeah.
We'd love you. Yes, we would love to see people again. It's been so long.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I mean, I'm hopeful that I would love to attend the next edition of Projector, online or in person, if possible. Now that we're very close to our ending time here, any closing remarks? Feel free. Let's go around just the panel, and feel free to share if there's anything else you want to share, or how people can connect with you. Because I think a great part of this panel is not only sharing what we've been working on and how people reacted to it, but also hopefully how what we had to say here not only can potentially inspire people, but also what emotions other developers and other narrative designers, game designers, etc., use to create their own experiences. Greg, do you want to?
Like running through my well, okay, so I was Greg. My website is greg.style, and I'm at Greg Lobanov on Twitter. That's the plug. Games that, man, Well, the last one that I played that I thought was really, really cool in this category, I guess, was Psychonauts 2, actually. It's a really, really interesting story where you're sort of like diving into the minds of other characters and learning about their inner world. So, like, the story has this just really natural, interesting foundation. And they are willing to, like, the game goes through quite a few different changes over the course of, like, in terms of visuals and the gameplay, in a way to sort of express, like, how the different characters internal worlds are. So as somebody who didn't really play the first game, I really like the second one. I don't think you have to play the first one to enjoy it. So I'd recommend that. Yeah.
Nice. Daniel, Lan. Yeah, but whoever wants to go next.
You go ahead, Lan. I need to think about this game more. This is a curveball that I wasn't ready for.
Okay. I kind of do too, but that's okay. I'm just gonna go for it. I'm Lan. My actual name, I guess, is Leanne, but nobody calls me that. So my website is LeanneRoed.com. And on Twitter, I'm Leanne Roed. Please don't call me Leanne. I don't like it. I'm kidding. It's fine. And then is the game to recommend?
It can be. I mean, don't feel pressure to recommend if nothing comes to mind.
I mean, one of my very favorite games of all time is Kentucky Route Zero. There's tons of emotions in there. So if you're looking for some feelings to feel, please play that game. I love that game. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and yeah, so I'm Daniel. I guess the best way to find me is probably just Twitter, D Mullins Games. And I don't know. I think, I guess one game that stuck with me for a while was probably Outer Wilds in terms of the emotional impact of it. So, I mean, and then to, I guess, double down on my point about endings, it had a pretty magnificent ending. So that's what I'm going to go with.
Awesome. So for people who want to connect, I'm Arthur, Twitter, Arthur Protasio, and online, arthurprotasio.com. So pretty easy to find me. It's interesting. You mentioned, Lan, Kentucky Route Zero, which, if I'm not mistaken, is also part of the LudoNarraCon highlight for the games that are being highlighted, etc. And then you mentioned, Daniel, your experience with Outer Wilds, which I think is fantastic. And one of the games, I mean, I played it such a long time ago, but Lucas Pope has already talked here at LudoNarraCon, and I love Papers, Please. I just remember when I first played Republic Times, even before Papers, Please came out, and then to me, Papers, Please just felt like an evolution of that oppressive feeling, of like dealing with these hard emotions. And I just think that the moral dilemmas are abound, and it is a game that I always go back to and think, wow, this experience really stuck with me. Of course, there's a very grim tone to it, but I guess maybe that's why I also am a fan of cautionary tales. But yeah, that's how I feel. We are at the end, so I just wanted to send a big, huge thank you to all of you, Daniel, Lan, and Greg. Thank you for accepting to be a part of this. Hopefully we can all meet together again in the future at a Heart Projector event. That would be awesome.
Be great.
No pressure, but it would be awesome.
Okay.
And I guess this is it. So, and to all of you watching us and connecting with us, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being a part of this journey. Thank you so much for playing your games. And please connect with us. We are dying to know what emotions you are also a fan of and connect especially with, so that we can learn from that as well.
Awesome. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yay!
Are we still live?